The reservation book lay open on the mahogany podium, its pages filled with names written in elegant script. She stood at the entrance of Le Bernardin's sister establishment, rain droplets still clinging to her wool coat, the fabric slightly threadbare at the cuffs. Her shoes, sensible flats with scuffed toes, left small wet prints on the marble floor. The hostess glanced up, her painted smile freezing mid-curve as she took in the woman's appearance. Gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, no jewelry except a plain watch with a scratched crystal, and a purse that had seen better decades. The hostess's eyes flicked past her, searching for someone more appropriate, someone who belonged. "Ma'am," the hostess said, her voice carrying just enough politeness to avoid outright rudeness. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," she replied quietly. "Under the name Walker." The hostess ran one manicured finger down the page, pausing at an entry near the bottom. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Table for one?" "That's correct." There was a pause, weighted with judgment. The hostess looked her over once more, cataloging every detail that didn't fit the establishment's carefully curated aesthetic. Behind the woman, a couple in designer clothes waited, their impatience barely concealed. The man checked his watch, a piece that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His companion sighed audibly. The hostess made a decision. "I'm terribly sorry, but I'm afraid there's been a mistake. That reservation appears to be for our casual dining room upstairs. This is our premier level." The woman's expression didn't change. "No mistake. I specifically requested the main dining room." The hostess's smile tightened. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in our bistro location down the street. They have a lovely atmosphere and much more reasonable prices." "I'm comfortable here," the woman said, her voice still soft but carrying an edge that made the hostess hesitate. Around them, other diners were beginning to notice the exchange. A waiter paused mid-stride, his tray of champagne flutes suspended in perfect balance. The sommelier, discussing wine pairings at a nearby table, lowered his voice as he tracked the developing situation. "Very well," the hostess said finally, her tone clipped. "If you'll follow me." She led the way through the dining room at a pace just slightly too fast, weaving between tables draped in crisp white linen, past displays of fresh flowers, under crystal chandeliers that cast warm light across faces accustomed to being seen. The table she stopped at was tucked in the far corner, partially obscured by a decorative screen, the kind of location reserved for parties who arrived unfashionably early, or customers the restaurant would prefer remained inconspicuous. "Here you are," the hostess announced, not bothering to pull out the chair. "Your server will be with you shortly." Before you could ask what you thought this story might be about, consider this. How many times have you walked past someone and made a complete assessment of their worth in 3 seconds? How often do we miss the truth because we're too busy confirming our assumptions? The woman settled into her seat, removing a small notebook from her purse and placing it on the table beside the menu. She didn't open either immediately. Instead, she sat quietly, observing. The dining room hummed with controlled energy, that particular frequency of establishments where discretion and excellence supposedly met. But what she noticed first wasn't the seamless service or the artful presentations emerging from the kitchen. It was the pattern of attention, how certain tables received immediate refreshment of water glasses while others waited, how servers bent closer to some guests and maintained professional distance from others. 15 minutes passed before anyone approached her table. The server who finally arrived was young, perhaps 23, with the carefully neutral expression of someone who'd learned to navigate the complicated hierarchy of fine dining. His name tag read Marcus. "Good evening," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" "Water is fine," she replied. "Still or sparkling?" "Still, please." Marcus nodded and disappeared. Another 10 minutes elapsed. The woman watched a party of 4 at a center table receive their sparkling water within 90 seconds of being seated. She noted the way the sommelier spent nearly 15 minutes discussing the wine list with them, his enthusiasm genuine, his body language open and engaged. When Marcus returned with her water, he placed it down with mechanical efficiency. "Ready to order?" "I have a few questions about the menu." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The seared scallops are popular." "How are they prepared?" "Pan-seared." served with cauliflower puree and brown butter. And the lamb? Rack of lamb, herb-crusted, with roasted vegetables. The descriptions were accurate but perfunctory, delivered with none of the passion or detail that fine dining service typically demanded. She could hear the server at the next table describing the chef's inspiration for a particular dish, the sourcing of ingredients, the technique involved. Marcus offered her facts alone, stripped of context or enthusiasm. "I'll have the scallops to start," she said, "and the lamb for the main course." Marcus collected the menu and left without asking about wine pairings, about dietary restrictions, about timing between courses, any of the details that transformed a meal from transaction to experience. She made a note in her notebook. Not much, just a few words, but her pen moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were recording and why. Across the room, the restaurant's general manager emerged from the kitchen, his attention focused on the center tables where the evening's most visible patrons dined. He stopped to greet a regular customer, a tech executive whose face appeared regularly in business publications. Their conversation lasted several minutes, punctuated by laughter and the kind of easy familiarity that came from recognition and respect. The manager's path never brought him near the corner table. The woman continued to observe, her trained eye catching details most diners would miss. The way the breadbasket arrived at some tables warm, and at others barely room temperature. How certain guests received personalized greetings from the chef, while others remained anonymous throughout their meals. The subtle but unmistakable two-tier system operating beneath the restaurant's veneer of equal hospitality. Her scallops arrived after a 40-minute wait. Marcus placed them down without ceremony. "Enjoy," he muttered, already turning away. The presentation was beautiful, she had to admit. 3 perfectly seared scallops arranged on a pristine white plate, the cauliflower puree swooped artfully, microgreens placed with precision. She lifted her fork and took the first bite. The scallops were overcooked, their edges tough, the centers lacking the buttery tenderness that should characterize properly prepared seafood. The cauliflower puree was cold, not slightly cool but genuinely cold, as if it had been plated too far in advance and left sitting. She made another note. Around her, other diners exclaimed over their courses, their satisfaction evident in expressions and body language. A woman 2 tables over closed her eyes in apparent bliss as she tasted her fish. A man at the center table held up his fork, examining the composition of his dish before photographing it from multiple angles. The disparity was striking. They were, she realized, eating in 2 different restaurants that happened to occupy the same physical space. Marcus returned to clear her starter plate. "Everything okay?" "Fine," she said, which was both true and completely false. The plate showed every sign of a disappointing dish, scallops barely touched, puree largely untouched. But Marcus didn't ask, didn't notice, or didn't care. The main course arrived after another lengthy wait. This time, Marcus didn't even offer the pro forma enjoyment wish. He simply placed the plate down and left. The lamb, like the scallops, was beautifully plated but poorly executed. Overcooked to the point of toughness, the herb crust burnt rather than crispy, the vegetables underseasoned and unevenly roasted. She ate a few bites, enough to confirm that the issues weren't isolated incidents but consistent problems, then set down her fork. At the table nearest hers, partially visible past the decorative screen, a couple celebrated what appeared to be an anniversary. The woman wore a dress that probably cost several $1,000s. Her companion had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being catered to. Their server, not Marcus, but a more senior staff member, attended to them with visible dedication. He described each course in loving detail, adjusted the wine pairing mid-meal based on their feedback, and personally ensured that every element met their expectations. Their food, from what the woman in the corner could observe, looked perfect. Properly cooked, properly seasoned, properly served. Same kitchen, same dining room, entirely different experience. When Marcus finally returned to clear her largely uneaten main course, he paused. "You didn't like it?" "It wasn't what I expected," she said carefully. Marcus shrugged slightly. "I can ask the chef to remake it." "No need," she replied. "Just the check, please." He seemed relieved, probably grateful to close out a table that had ordered modestly and tipped on a small bill. The check arrived within minutes, appearing more quickly than any of the food had. She paid in cash, including a tip that Marcus would likely find disappointingly small but appropriate for the service rendered. As she stood to leave, she took one final look around the dining room. The general manager was now at the anniversary couples table, shaking hands and accepting their compliments with practiced grace. The hostess was seating another party, a group that arrived in expensive cars and designer clothes, her smile warm and genuine in a way it hadn't been earlier. No one noticed the woman in the threadbare coat as she made her way to the exit. No one except Marcus, who watched her leave with visible relief, already turning his attention to his next table, a party of 3 who looked like they belonged. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of autumn day when the city felt perpetually damp. In a converted warehouse building across town, she climbed 3 flights of stairs to an office that commanded a view of the harbor. The space was modest but purposeful. Walls lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves, a desk covered with menus, receipts, and notebooks filled with careful observations. She hung her still damp coat on a hook by the door and settled into the worn leather chair that had belonged to her predecessor, a legendary critic whose reviews could fill a restaurant for months or empty it in weeks. She opened her laptop, pulled up the blank template for her column, and stared at the cursor blinking against white space. 37 years ago, she had started in this industry as a dishwasher in a small neighborhood restaurant, working her way through cooking school between shifts. She'd been a line cook, a sous chef, eventually an executive chef at a restaurant that earned recognition from the same publications that now published her criticism. But a hand injury, sustained in a moment of inattention with a mandolin, had ended her kitchen career. The nerve damage left her unable to maintain the stamina and precision that professional cooking demanded. Rather than leave the industry entirely, she'd pivoted to writing about it, bringing a chef's understanding of technique and a worker's awareness of what happened behind the scenes to her criticism. For 15 years, she'd been one of the most respected voices in regional food journalism. Her reviews were known for their fairness, their technical accuracy, and their refusal to prioritize style over substance. She never revealed her identity during visits, never made reservations under her known name, never dressed in ways that would signal her importance. Some critics believed anonymity was impossible in the age of social media, that any serious reviewer would eventually be recognized. She thought that view betrayed a certain kind of privilege, an inability to imagine that someone could move through expensive spaces without being seen. Because the truth was, invisibility was easy. All you had to do was look like someone who didn't matter. She began to write, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the muscle memory of thousands of previous reviews. She wrote about the scallops, describing the overcooked texture and cold accompaniment with clinical precision. She wrote about the lamb, the burnt crust and tough meat. She wrote about the 40-minute wait between courses, the perfunctory service, the complete absence of any attempt to understand or enhance her dining experience. But she also wrote about what she'd observed at other tables. The different food quality, the engaged service, the personal attention from management. She described the 2-tiered system, with the same careful detail she'd applied to the failed dishes. And then she wrote something that would, in the coming days, generate more conversation than any review she'd published in years. She wrote about what it meant to be invisible, to move through a space designed for pleasure and celebration, while being treated as if your presence was an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a guest to be welcomed. She wrote about dignity, about the social contract that should exist between restaurant and diner, about the difference between service and servility. She wrote about class, about the assumptions encoded in appearance, about who gets seen and who gets ignored. When she finished, the review ran to nearly 3,000 words, longer than her usual work but impossible to trim without losing essential context. She read it through twice, checking facts and softening nothing, then sent it to her editor with a subject line that read simply, "For Saturday's edition." Her editor called within an hour. "This is powerful," he said. "Also potentially devastating. Are you certain about every detail?" "I'm certain," she replied. The restaurant's response would come quickly. By noon, her editor forwarded an email from the general manager, his tone professionally outraged. The review contained allegations of discriminatory service, claims that struck at the restaurant's reputation and bottom line. He demanded a meeting, suggested the critic had misunderstood isolated incidents, implied that perhaps the reviewer had arrived with predetermined conclusions. She'd seen this response pattern before. Deny, minimize, redirect. questioned the critic's motives rather than examining the restaurant's practices. She wrote a brief response, declining the meeting but offering the restaurant an opportunity to provide a formal statement that would be published alongside the review. That afternoon, sitting in a coffee shop near her office, she overheard two people discussing a restaurant they'd visited recently. "The food was amazing," one said, "but I felt like they were barely tolerating us, like we weren't the right kind of customers." The other nodded knowingly. "I hate that feeling. Like, you're supposed to be grateful they let you in." The conversation crystallized something she'd been trying to articulate in her writing for years. The best restaurants didn't just serve good food. They created spaces where diners felt genuinely welcomed, where excellence in cuisine was matched by generosity of spirit. The worst restaurants, regardless of their technical skill, were the ones that made people feel small. She thought about Marcus, the young server who'd provided such minimal service. Was he acting on explicit instructions or implicit understanding? Had someone told him that the woman in the corner didn't merit attention? Or had he simply absorbed the restaurant's values through observation? She suspected the latter. Discrimination in fine dining rarely announced itself. It operated through glances and gestures, through patterns of attention and neglect that became normalized until no one questioned them. The next day, she received a voicemail from someone who identified himself as the restaurant's owner. His tone was careful, somewhere between conciliatory and defensive. He suggested that perhaps there had been a miscommunication, that the staff member in question was new and still learning, that certainly the restaurant didn't condone any form of discriminatory service. He invited her to return for a complimentary meal so he could personally ensure she received the experience the restaurant was known for. She didn't return the call. Her review published on Saturday morning, appearing both in print and online. By noon, it had been shared thousands of times. Comments sections filled with similar stories. People recounting times they'd been ignored or dismissed, or made to feel unwelcome in expensive restaurants. Some defended the establishment, suggesting the critic was being oversensitive or looking for controversy. But more agreed, grateful someone had articulated an experience they'd felt, but struggled to describe. The restaurant issued a formal statement, expressing disappointment with the review, and reiterating their commitment to exceptional service for all guests. The statement was carefully worded, apologizing for nothing specific, while suggesting they took all feedback seriously. But by Monday, 3 members of the kitchen staff had reached out privately through the publication, describing a workplace culture that prioritized appearance and assumed wealth over actual hospitality. One server detailed explicit instructions about how to allocate attention based on perceived value. A line cook described how certain tickets were prioritized over others, not based on timing, but on who had ordered them. The restaurant's carefully crafted statement began to unravel under the weight of internal testimony. By Wednesday, the owner announced he was stepping back from daily operations to allow new management to implement comprehensive service training. The hostess, it was quietly reported, had resigned. Marcus posted something on social media about learning difficult lessons about implicit bias. The restaurant didn't close, but it changed. That was all she'd ever wanted. She didn't write to destroy. She wrote to illuminate, to hold up a mirror that showed establishments what they'd become, to create enough pressure that improvement became preferable to defensiveness. A month later, she returned to the restaurant unannounced, making a reservation under a different name. The new hostess greeted her warmly, showing no visible reaction to her modest appearance. She was seated at a good table, not corner obscurity but prime dining room placement. Her server was attentive without being obsequious, knowledgeable without being pretentious. The food was well prepared, properly executed, served at appropriate temperatures and appropriate intervals, and she noticed, as she observed the room, that this quality of attention extended to all tables. The couple in casual clothes by the window received the same detailed menu descriptions as the anniversary party in designer outfits. An elderly man dining alone got the same consideration as the group of business executives. The transformation wasn't perfect, but it was real. She wrote about that visit too, a shorter follow-up piece, acknowledging change without erasing history. Some readers appreciated the fairness. Others accused her of going too soft, of letting the restaurant off easy. But she understood something those critics didn't. Restaurants, like people, were capable of learning. The question was whether they had to be forced to see before they'd acknowledge what had been there all along. 3 months after the initial review, she received an invitation to speak at a culinary conference. The topic was ethics in hospitality, and the organizers wanted her perspective on how restaurants could ensure equitable service. She almost declined, uncomfortable with the idea of becoming the public face of a conversation that should be larger than any individual voice. But her editor convinced her. Someone has to say these things out loud, he argued. And you've earned the credibility to be heard. The conference was held in a convention center downtown, attended by chefs, restaurateurs, service professionals, and students from culinary programs. She stood backstage, listening to the applause for the previous speaker die down, feeling the familiar nervousness that preceded any public appearance. When she walked onto the stage, she saw recognition ripple through the audience. Her anonymity in restaurants remained intact, protected by careful habits and the invisibility that came with ordinariness. But within the industry, among professionals who read her work carefully, her face was known. She spoke for 30 minutes, describing not just the experience at that particular restaurant, but the patterns she'd observed across hundreds of dining establishments over 15 years. She talked about how discrimination in fine dining wasn't always obvious, how it operated through small gestures and systematic neglect rather than explicit prohibition. She described the way certain accents prompted slower, louder explanations, how diners with visible disabilities were assumed to need simpler menus, how groups of young women received different wine recommendations than groups of young men. And she talked about the economics of it, the short-sightedness of businesses that alienated potential customers based on superficial assessment, how many repeat diners had restaurants lost by making someone feel unwelcome on a first visit, how many positive reviews had never been written because the reviewer felt too uncomfortable to return. During the question period, a young chef raised his hand. How do we fix it? He asked. If we've been operating this way without realizing it, how do we change? She thought about Marcus, about the hostess who'd resigned, about all the people working in restaurants who'd absorbed problematic values without examining them. Start by believing it's happening, she said. The hardest part is getting past the defensiveness, the impulse to explain away every criticism as oversensitivity or misunderstanding. If multiple people are telling you they felt unwelcome, believe them. Then look at your systems. Who gets the good tables? Who waits longest for service? Whose complaints get taken seriously? The patterns reveal themselves if you're willing to see them. Another question came from a woman in the back row. But how do we balance hospitality with economic reality? Some customers do spend more, do come back more often. Isn't it natural to prioritize them? The question was reasonable, voiced politely, but it contained the assumption that had enabled inequity for generations. Of course, regular customers deserve recognition, she replied. But there's a difference between remembering someone's preferences and treating strangers as inferior. Every regular customer was once a first-time diner. The question is whether they felt welcomed enough to return. After the session ended, several people approached her. Some offered thanks, grateful someone had articulated issues they'd experienced. Others pushed back more gently than the online critics, but with similar concerns about whether her standards were realistic. One restaurant owner, a woman who'd been in the business for 30 years, waited until the crowd thinned before speaking. You're right about everything you said, the owner began. And it's uncomfortable to admit how long I've been complicit in the patterns you described, but I'm trying to do better. She's implementing new training, examining her seating practices, actively working to create a more equitable environment. It was the response she hoped for but rarely saw. Not defensive justification, but honest reckoning. On the train ride home, she thought about the trajectory that had brought her from dishwasher to chef to critic, about all the kitchens she'd worked in, the dining rooms she'd observed, the thousands of meals that had taught her what excellence actually meant. Excellence wasn't just technical skill, wasn't just expensive ingredients properly prepared. Excellence was the integration of ability with values, the understanding that how you treated people mattered as much as what you served them. Some critics saw their role as celebrating genius, as identifying and elevating the rare restaurants that achieved transcendent cuisine. She'd never seen it that way. Her role was to tell the truth, to describe experiences accurately, and to hold establishments accountable not just for their food, but for their humanity. The woman in the threadbare coat would visit many more restaurants, would continue to be underestimated and ignored, would keep documenting the gap between hospitality's promises and its practices, because some stories needed to be told by someone who knew what it felt like to be invisible. If this story resonates with you, consider sharing it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity isn't determined by appearance, and respect shouldn't require recognition. Subscribe to hear more stories about the quiet observations that reveal larger truths. Because sometimes, the most important conversations start with someone brave enough to name what everyone else pretends not to see.